That's a great reading that Alison brought to us there. Really famous reading. The Transfiguration, one of my favourite stories in the Bible. And in that story, we've got this wonderful experience that the disciples see Jesus with Elijah and Moses. And it seems like everything's coming together, all the fulfilment of the prophets. They're beginning to see that Jesus is up there with these great heroes of their faith, and then with those wonderful words at the end where God says, "This is my son, my chosen, listen to him." This sense that Jesus is divine. You know, this is a moment. This is a life-changing moment. This is going to change everything forever. But within this as well, this is the beginning of Jesus preparing for his passion. This is almost, if you like, as good as it gets. And from that time on, things begin to get really quite difficult for the disciples. Things begin to get really hard. And as we've been looking over the last few weeks in Corinthians, that's been one of the main themes of this gospel, of the letter to the Corinthians, is that Paul was writing to the Corinthian church to say that life is tough, but you can rejoice. Life is tough, but you can rejoice. And for that reason, I think it's a really good book for us to look at as we prepare for Lent, which is obviously coming up starting on Wednesday. And just a little plug as well, I've got my copy, thanks to Gabby, of The Purpose-Driven Life, which is something that we're encouraging each other to read during this Lent as well. Now, I want to tell you about one of our family routines. It's always great to have a family routine, the kind of things that as children you remember for the rest of your life. And we've got a really simple one. On a Saturday tea time, we sit down together in front of the TV with homemade burgers and we watch, well, can you guess what we watch? Gladiators! We love Gladiators. There's Strictly as well, that's before Christmas, but after Christmas, Gladiator. And Gladiators really does unite us all together. And we sit down and we watch this wonderful show that takes me back to my own childhood. And my favourite Gladiator, if you're familiar with the show, is one called Legend. Do you know Legend, anyone? So, and the thing with Legend is he wins everything, and as well as winning everything, he's so comically arrogant about it. And I shouldn't like him for that, but I do. I just find him really entertaining. And last night, Legend was on the show and he was taking part in this event called Hanging Tough, which, if you can imagine, this church is set out like the Gladiators arena. You'd have one platform here and one on the other side of the church, and lots of rings on chains hanging down. And the contenders have to get across, swing from ring to ring, across to the other platform on the other side, without getting caught by the gladiator who is in hot pursuit of them. And this Hanging Tough event is where Legend, the gladiator, is in his element. He's never been defeated. But last night something strange happened. The contestant got past Legend to the other platform and just left Legend dangling in the air. Well, this didn't go down well with Legend, and he demanded that he should have another go against the next contestant, which is unprecedented because normally they bring in another gladiator to take on the next contestant. But Legend's ego was bruised so much, he said to Bradley Walsh, "I'm going to go up again. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to make amends. I'm going to put this right." And you can guess what happened next. The next contestant took to the platform and started swinging, and again got past Legend to the other side to get full points. And Legend had gone, in my eyes, from hero to zero. I was not so impressed. Now, I'm not sure what Legend will be doing today to dust himself down and rebuild his fragile ego, but I'm quite sure that he won't be picking up Paul's letter to the Corinthians. But perhaps he should. Gladiators would have been a part of the culture in ancient Corinth. Not the lycra-clad, muscle-bound, oily-skinned athletes we see on prime-time TV, but more the armed warriors who entertained audiences throughout the Roman Empire in their battles with criminals and wild animals and with other gladiators as well. The gladiator would fight to the death, and in the vast majority of cases it wouldn't be their death. For Corinthians, a gladiator would be the ultimate symbol of strength, and people would flock to the amphitheatre to watch them in action. Yet Paul's message, as we've been hearing over the last couple of weeks, challenged this Corinthian worldview. God chose what is weak in this world to shame the wise. That's what we read in today's passage. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I spoke on the first few verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and I painted the picture of this ancient city of Corinth, a city built on success and on opportunity and on winning and on the cult of celebrity. I picked out the familiarities and the similarities with our own culture. And in the Corinthian church, these same values, this worldview, was mirrored in the way they did church. Now, Paul, as a disciple, Paul as an apostle, his role really was to build the early church. And at that time, there was churches springing up all over the Roman world as they'd heard the story about Jesus. And it's probably about 2 or 3 decades after Jesus has died where these churches are being planted. But nobody had ever done church before. This was a completely new thing. And Paul was working with the Jews, who were obviously used to doing things in a very different way, and the Gentiles, who were used to doing things in a very different way, and trying to bring them together. So he had a really tough task in establishing and building these churches. And it was so easy for these churches to, without regular input from Paul, to just mirror what was going on in the world around them. So Paul needed to tell the Corinthians that Christ calls them to be in this world, but not to be of it. To not mirror their culture, but to model a different way of living. One of the words that I picked up in our passage today was that word sanctification. Sanctification means to be set apart. It means to live a holy life, to do things in a different way. When Jesus redeemed us by his death on the cross, he called on us to be sanctified, to be set apart from the world, to live in a different way. In last week's talk, John brought us the message, the paradox really between the Christian message and the Corinthian message. The verse that stuck out for me was, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." And John painted a great picture, very visually, through lots of research really, of just how offensive the symbol of the cross was for the Corinthians. We look at the cross now, and John pointed this out, that we see it all over our churches and it's become quite sanitised. But actually, the cross was the ultimate symbol of weakness and humiliation. In the Roman Empire, this would not be the symbol that you would choose to start a new religion. And in the passage that we've looked at today, the theme continues. It says, God chose what is foolish in this world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in this world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, the things that are not, to reduce to nothing the things that are. And this, according to Paul, is so no one might boast in the presence of God. And Paul goes on to write, "Let the one who boasts boast in the Lord." And that word really struck me, boasting. It's an interesting word, isn't it? It's not a particularly attractive word. And boasting has a bad reputation in Christian circles, and that's probably largely because of the Corinthian church. Because they were selfish. They boasted about their own accomplishments. They bragged about their achievements, which they were quite sure was done on their own strengths. They were responsible for their own successes. But Paul says to them in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he says to them, "Your boasting is not good." But Paul talks about himself boasting as well. "If I must boast," he says in 2 Corinthians, "I will boast of the things that show my weakness." So Paul is talking of boasting, but in a very different way throughout his correspondence with the Corinthians. In that passage there, in that verse there, "If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness." He goes on then to list what's known as the hardship lists. He does quite a bit of this, particularly in 2 Corinthians, where he does like a bullet point of all of the trials and tribulations he has gone through, all the persecutions, all of the shipwrecks, all of the times in prison, all of the lashings that he's had. And he said, "And look, I am still here, so I will boast." Later on in 2 Corinthians, he says, and I think there should be another slide for this one, "So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me." So Paul's using this word boasting in a very different way. And actually, when we look at the text, we see the same word, to boast. But it's a slightly different word in the Greek text that Paul is using, and that completely transforms its meaning. So there's two words for boasting. There's that kind of selfish boasting that we're all perhaps a little guilty of sometimes. And then there's the boasting that Paul describes in himself, which is a word closer in its meaning to rejoicing or to glory. And if we substitute the word, say, in that passage there with rejoice, it can take on a very different meaning. "So I will rejoice all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me." Paul can only boast not because of anything he has done, but because in spite of all his hardships, he recognises what God has done in his life, that God has claimed him in Christ. And we can rejoice in the same today. In our weaknesses, we are strong. In our pains, we can rejoice because God has claimed us in Christ. And this is why the Corinthians are such good letters to read as we come into Lent, because they help us to prepare for the temptations and the trials and the pain of life, just as Jesus experienced temptation, trial and pain in his life. It steers us away from being self-centred and worldly cultured, instead to be Christ-centred and cross-cultured. Paul was writing to the Corinthians to convince them of this simple message at the heart of the Christian faith that many of those people had never heard before. Paul said, "The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." Jesus died on the cross, that terrible symbol of Roman oppression and humiliation, to take away all of the badness in the world and to make things new so that we can rejoice. And that changes everything for us. That's it. That's it. It's that simple. Jesus died for everything in the past, the present, and the future to put things right so that we could know God. And this week we've seen things on the news that might have shocked us or even scared us. But actually we can say that all of that has already been dealt with because of what Jesus did on the cross. This morning, as we go on from here and move on into Lent, my prayer for us all is that we can grasp that simple message of God's love in a new way for ourselves. That we might know afresh, or even for the first time, what the cross means for us, finding joy amidst our weaknesses, because that's the power of Christ in us. Stuart Townend, who's no relation by the way, writes these words, which I'm going to finish with. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will rejoice in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart. His wounds have paid my ransom.